Hello and welcome back to the Peterpodcast. I'm your host, reporter Taylor Clydesdale, and with me this week from Town Ward is Councilor Kemi Akapo. Today we're going to be talking about transportation in Peterborough, including alternative modes of transportation.
I mean, my lived experience in Peterborough in terms of getting around the city is either mostly focused on taking transit, walking, or cycling, and, taking a cab occasionally when that's the best option for me. I do drive occasionally when, there's a need for it to happen, so I do have a little bit of that perspective, but I would say more than not, when I'm thinking particularly of transit, I'm thinking about it from a user perspective as well, which I think might be pretty unique on City Council. I think most of the other councillors, if not all, have their own cars and drive everywhere.
And we're also going to be talking about the challenges of figuring out the budget, as well as the future of the Canadian Canoe Museum. So, hope you enjoy the show.
So my name is Kemi Akapo. I am many things, but the reason I'm here today is because I am City Councilor, one of the newer City Councilors representing Town Ward, the best ward.
Yes, you were the new Town Ward Councillor elected in October. Mm-hmm. Man, October feels like it
was a really long time ago. It feels like it was like a year ago.
Yes, but you're part of the new term council, and you guys started up in the new year. And what are your thoughts so far on being a new city councillor?
I am learning a lot. It's and I would say that's one of my favorite things about it is just how much I'm learning. Even just today, reading some of the older reports that council got, I was just like, oh wow, this is really good information to have, and this might make me sound like a nerd, but I really wish that everybody in the city read those reports, because I feel like the discussions that we would have as a city would be, I don't want to say elevated, but would be, I think it'd be great if everyone was sort of on the same page, or at least read what the reports that we get are. And I think the level of discussions would just be a little bit more varied. And not that they're not now, but it would be good, I think, if everybody has this knowledge, because it's super important to know.
And in case anyone does want to take a look, city staff releases...
Yep, I think it's every Thursday.
Yep, they release their reports, and anyone can read them. Yep. So just go on to City Council's website, and they can get... I don't know if it's all the information that you guys get, but the general reports. Yeah.
No, we got the exact same things. There's, was it 2 weeks ago? I was really ill, and so they send the reports to a location, and I wasn't able to get it to that location, so I just read it online. And it's the exact same report that we get. The only thing that the public doesn't get is if there's a closed session. I think that's what they call the closed session. Then they don't get that information, but I think we've only ever had one or two of those meetings. So
okay,
yeah.
And you started off your tenure as a city councillor with budget committee, and you decided on the 2019 city budget.
Yes.
So what was that process like?
That was a really illuminating process. Again, I learned a lot, which I appreciated. I understand why it's done when it's done, but it definitely was, to get elected, to be sworn in, and then the first thing you do is decide on this massive budget. In a way, it's really good to start off that way, because then you have a really good sort of bird's eye view of all the different things the city has its hands on. But there was a lot of phone calls, particularly to my co-ward mate, Dean Pappas. It helped that he was the chair of the finance committee as well. It was just like, can you explain this? I don't understand what's happening. A lot of calls to staff as well. It was, I will say the learning curve is quite steep. Even though I've been actively involved, going to city council meetings for years and reading those reports, the learning curve is quite steep. And, I still work a full-time job on top of that, right? So it's trying to find the time to figure things out. But I'm really enjoying it, and every week that goes by, I learn a little bit more and feel better about it.
Was there anything that surprised you, or that you kind of looked at and went, wow, I didn't know that this happened in the budget process?
Not really, because I've I've sat and listened to the budget process before, so I was a little bit familiar with it. Not so much, there wasn't anything that surprised me per se, but it was, I think it's just more connecting the dots where, when you're a constituent and you're sort of listening, you kind of, at least I was, when I was listening, you listen to the things that you're really interested in, and, maybe they get to a topic that you're like, I don't really know much about this, and it's not really my passion. You kind of zone out for a bit, and then they talk about something. But when you're council, you have to listen to all of it.
Yeah.
And
because everything is someone's important, passionate topic.
Yeah. So it's like, connecting the dot between this, and trying to... I get a better understanding of why sometimes projects take longer than people expect them to, or are delayed. And one big thing that I asked Richard Freeman, he's our the finance person for the city, or treasurer. I forget his official title. Sorry, Richard.
I think it's chief financial officer.
Okay, there we go. CFO. Was about development charges, and just trying to understand the history of that, and how they affect decisions that are made. So he gave me, this much reading to do, and I'm going through all of that. But the budget process is really, it's good, and I think, but as with everything else, I would love to see more people getting engaged with it. The difficult part though is there's so many needs, and there's only so much money to go around.
And that's something that, every budget season, something that I witness as a reporter is, you looking at the community's feedback, and I'm sure you see it too, is this idea that like, oh, we're putting in money into this one thing, but you get those critics who say you could be putting it into something else. The one that I always see is homelessness or housing. Right. Why do you put money into blank when you could be putting it into housing or homelessness? How do you speak to those people? Do you kind of relay your thoughts to those people? And if so, what do you say?
I'm happy to speak to anyone who comes and talks to me. I don't not speak to people. I wouldn't say that those people are often coming to me, though. It's more sort of on the internet commenting and not...
That's fair. Social media does tend to posit those type of comments a little bit more confidently.
And to that I say, yes, but there's so many issues that are important. And I don't think that we should only focus on one issue. And the city is made up of many parts. Many parts make the whole, and we have to tend and adjust to all those parts. So I think it's a balancing act of when and how do you fund, project X versus project Y, and there's a high demand for project Y to be addressed. But if we were to ignore project X for 3, 4, 5 years, and that project becomes a really high demand, right? So it's all a balancing act. It's like trying to, when you work with your own personal finances, it's like, I really want to buy, say, like a car, but at the same time, I also have to pay my rent and get my groceries and, live my life, right? So you put a little bit of money aside every month or every paycheck, whatever, and then eventually you're able to tend to everything. But it's a balancing act.
Now, we do have a provincial government who they haven't released their budget yet.
No, we're all waiting for that.
Yeah, but the general consensus seems to be that to expect that, as I believe, Finance Minister Vic Fideli had said, everyone's going to have to make sacrifices. So was that a big factor in the budgeting process for you guys? Or
a couple councillors brought that up, saying that they wanted to wait to hear what the province was going to do before deciding what to fund and what not to fund, or how much to fund, certain things. And sometimes it's challenging because the province will, the term is download, but essentially will tell municipalities, okay, now you are responsible for the service that we used to provide, but we're going to make you do it now. And we're not going to give you funding for it, or we'll give you, half the funding that we used to put in on it. So then it's challenging for municipalities to take that up because we're mandated by the province to provide this service. We have limited funding, so that means we either have to draw funds from another source, we increase taxes, or we cut certain programs out. And that's never an easy decision to make, how to do what. So if if what you're being asked to do is increasing and the funding does not match that level of the ask, and that's really challenging. And definitely a couple of councillors brought that up during discussions, saying, the province is telling us we have to do this, but they're not providing funding. And it's not so much reluctance to provide the service, but saying, well, at what point can we continue to provide the service if there's no money to do it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess right now there are quite a few question marks because the provincial budget process doesn't, the budget isn't made public until I believe late March, so it is a bunch of question marks right now. So
yeah, and it's hard to make decisions on things that you don't really know, but because we have to. So some of them are made based on precedent, others in good faith. It can be challenging.
Yeah. Well, let's move on because let's move on to one of your new jobs as a city councillor. Because one of the portfolios that you've been left with is transit.
Yes.
And that was formerly the portfolio of Don Faciliatis. That was his baby. So I'm kind of curious.
Correct. Yes.
How's that been going, and what was your response to that appointment?
I was happy to have that appointment. I had spoken to Don about it in the early days and just sort of asked him what was it like, what are the main issues, what do I need to know, and we had a conversation about it. He gave me some information, and so far I spent the time learning. As I'm saying, not everything's new to me, but I'm learning as much as I possibly can, trying to absorb as much information. So I've met with all the staff who work in the transportation division, which has been really neat. And transportation covers, everything from transit to cycling to sidewalks and parking. There's a lot to learn there.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about your appointment to that portfolio is on our way up to the office, you were telling me about how you got down here today, which was a cab, because you don't own a car.
I don't.
You take public transit, cab. You cycle?
Yes.
And that's interesting because, when a lot of people think transportation in the city, they think get in your car and drive somewhere.
Yes.
So do you think that your perspective on and your experience on transportation kind of shapes how you view the transportation portfolio?
Oh, definitely. Definitely, for sure. My lived experience in Peterborough in terms of getting around the city is either mostly focused on taking transit, walking, or cycling, and taking a cab occasionally when that's the best option for me. I do drive occasionally when there's a need for it to happen, so I do have a little bit of that perspective. But I would say more than not, when I'm thinking particularly of transit, I'm thinking about it from a user perspective as well, which I think might be pretty unique on city council. I think most of the other councillors, if not all, have their own cars and drive everywhere, which is whatever, that's fine. If that's what they need to do, that's what they need to do. But I've so far I've been pretty lucky in terms of even this far into my tenure, being able to not purchase a car yet, though I think that's going to need to happen.
And how many people do you think there are in Peterborough? And I don't expect you to come up with a number on the spot, but do you think there's a large number of people or a small number of people here in Peterborough that, like you, don't own a car, that rely on public transit or bike lanes in order to get around? And how do you think those people will be affected by changes in transportation?
Right. I do think I know that there are people who rely on transit. And people use transit for a number of reasons. There are some who use it because, they're not able to afford a car, or they had a car and weren't able to maintain it and, have to rely on transit. There's folks who have made a conscious decision, who perhaps do own a car, but prefer not to use it as much or reserve it for going outside of the city, that type of thing, who use transit for that reason. And I did speak to a lot of people who would like to take transit, perhaps not as their regular everyday mode of transportation, but as an option to use. But they find it challenging to use because right now it's a lot easier to drive than it in terms of time than it is to take transit. Say if you're going from one part of town to the other, and people tend to use what's most convenient. But part of this transit review that's happening is going to try to address that. How can we build the system, whether it's the way the routes are or the way, I guess the way the routes are or the way the routes take. How do we change it or build it in such a way that would encourage more people to use transit, and not just as I have no other option resort, but as a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to former Mayor Daryl Bennett, on the campaign trail, we spoke about transportation, and he spoke about the need for the parkway, and, having roads in and out in subdivisions. And he had said, more and more people are using cars, so we need to account for that infrastructure. I'm wondering what you think of that sentiment. Do we need to be building more roads to account for more cars, or do we divert that in some way to alternative modes of transportation? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm not, I'm not naive. People use their cars, and I don't anticipate that, next week everyone's going to wake up and say, no, we're not driving anymore, and that's it. But I do think we need to invest in alternative modes of transportation. I don't think we should only build more and more roads for cars to use. I think if people find alternative ways that are safe, affordable for them to use, they will consider using them. That being said, people still drive around, so we still need to make sure that the conditions of our roads are good, and that the roads that we have cater to the not cater to the needs, but are sufficient for what the drivers in Peterborough require, and for what our roads can sustain as well. So again, as with everything, it's a balanced approach, but I don't think we should focus solely just on building more roads. But we also need to focus on alternative modes of transportation as well. It all feeds into each other.
It's all interconnected.
Yes. Yeah.
And see, an interesting decision that I thought kind of demonstrated a change in transportation mentality between the last council and this one was a decision around Charlotte Street. So the Charlotte Street reconstruction is planned for, I don't know if it's planned to start this year or next year, but that project's going to happen. And the previous council had decided, you know what, we're going to put bike lanes over on King Street, which runs parallel, and then leave Charlotte Street just for pedestrians and cars. And now your council has gone back and said, okay, we're going to accommodate bike lanes on Charlotte Street. So I'm wondering if you can explain that decision a bit for me.
Well, I think so. In the previous council, when the discussion came up about cycling lanes on Charlotte and King, there was a lot of support for having it on Charlotte Street. However, and there's a little bit of it seemed that I wasn't around the table at the time. I don't want to comment too much on what happened, but there were discussions about whether or not the vote that happened the night it was decided to have it on King Street was fair or not.
I think it was Councillor Keith Brielle was away from the council table that night, and then Councillor Henry Clark declared a conflict of interest because the place where he works uses Charlotte Street as a corridor. So the makeup of the vote did change that night. Yeah.
So whether or not that would have changed if Councillor Brielle had been there, I don't know. But yeah, so this council decided to put it back on Charlotte Street. And I personally didn't like the sort of the Charlotte versus King. I was like, well, why not both? Why does it have to be one or the other? So I think the idea was we're rebuilding Charlotte Street, so let's get it right. Let's do it right now, and not come back 5-10 years and say, oh shoot, I wish we had added cycling lanes on it. So that was a decision council made, and I voted to support it. I actually wanted it to go all the way to Water Street, not just end on Aylmer as it currently is, but that's a decision that was made, and I'm happy with that.
All right.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a short break.
Okay.
Come back, touch on a couple of other important Peterborough topics, and yeah. So we'll be right back then.
Awesome.
All right. So we are back on the Peterpodcast.
We're back.
And let's talk about some other topics.
Okay.
So we've got over the beginning stages of you being on council. Let's talk about some of the issues that you've already had to start to deal with. Including at the last general committee meeting, your council made a decision on an initial decision. It still needs to be ratified on the lease for the farmers market at Morrow Park.
Yes.
There was some conflict between some vendors and the market board that led to an offshoot. There's now a separate market.
Yes.
So there's kind of some baggage there with that.
Definitely.
Dialogue.
Yeah.
So your council decided to extend the lease for another year while council kind of takes a look at its options. And one of those options is the request for proposal or kind of putting the market's operation out to tender. So maybe you can explain that decision a bit for me and kind of explain what that means.
Right. So, this is a part of a normal process that goes on. I guess the contract with the current farmers market was coming to an end, and I think there was an option to renew for a year, but don't quote me on that. So the city found itself in a place. It's like, okay, well, we have to make a decision, and we want to make a decision that's well informed and not rushed, particularly because around the sensitivities to the farmers market. So we decided to extend it for a year, which would give us enough time to get buy-in from the community and get information from the community as to what it is that they're looking for. What are some of the strengths of the current market, and what is it that they'd like to see going forward. So I'm excited about that. I think it's really good to do that, to go out to the community and say, what is it that you're looking for and how can we provide that? And putting out the request for proposals, I think it's always good to see what else is out there. And if the current market is the one that's successful, then okay, all the power to them and let them continue doing their work. But I some people have said, oh, you're trying to kick them out, and that's not true. It's I think it's important to always give everybody sort of an equal opportunity to put forward the proposals, and then we'll review those proposals and decide what we think fits best with what the community wants and what the city is looking for as well.
And during the last general committee meeting, your ward mate, Dean Pappas, had said that a few years ago there was an RFP put out for the operation of the city's shelters. And what ended up happening was all the shelter operators stayed the same.
Exactly.
There was no changes.
Yeah.
No, I shouldn't say there was no changes, but the operators remained the same.
Yes, there were changes. But that's I think it's pretty common for any services that I shouldn't say I think, I know it's common for any services that the city provides. There's, you sign a contract for X amount of years, and then there's usually options to renew for 1, 2, or 3 years. And then once that time is up, then you resubmit your application or you decide to walk away, and then the city finds somebody else is new. And this is just the same thing that's happening. Yeah.
So what's it like to get involved? I mean, get involved with this issue, because it did stem from some issues that were from the last couple of years. There is a lot of kind of, the word is politics, I think it is. Yeah. There's a lot of political baggage with this issue. So should the city be getting involved in this, or is this something that the city should be hands off?
Well, I mean, we are the ones that issue the tender, so we have to be involved somehow. We can't. I don't see how we wouldn't be involved in it. Or do you mean that we would have sort of like an outside group sort of looking at it and then making the decision or making a recommendation? Well, is that what you mean?
Well, I guess the let me phrase it another way.
Okay.
How much should the city be involved in the business of a farmer's market, and how much should be left to kind of the farmer's market itself to decide how it conducts its business?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for you for that. I think that's all part of the process of determining what kind of farmers market you want, and what the terms and conditions of that are. So if at the time of deciding, it's decided that the city will have 60% sway on things, and I think it all depends on what decision is made at the time of signing, and then whatever decision is made at that time should be respected, or reviewed if need be. I think that's all I've got to say on that.
All right. Yeah, it's certainly it's an interesting topic for sure, and I think a lot of people too. They just kind of want the farmers market. I won't call it conflict, but there has been conflicts between vendors. I think they kind of want the farmers market situation resolved so that they can kind of have their community hubs back.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's. I don't want to say it's a shame, but it hasn't been. I wouldn't say it's been fun for anyone, and it's. Controversy tends to sometimes breed more, what's the word? I don't know. I have friends who lived in Ottawa, who lived, in Montreal, and they're like, man, we heard about your farmers market, and they hadn't heard about it prior to this conflict. I'm like, this is a shame because this shouldn't be the reason why, we have a farmers market. But, at least now they're aware, so hopefully they'll come and check it out when they're in Peterborough.
Yes.
But, yeah, it's, it was disheartening, but, it's happened, and I know that I don't know the full story, and I don't necessarily think I need to know the full story. I think it's important to know what the city can do, and make a decision that's best for all the residents, so.
Yeah. Let's move on to another topic, one that's still similarly Morrow building-ish, because there's other things that are happening in that area, including the potential, possibly, for a new major sport and event center. Now, there's a couple of spots where that could go, one of them being Morrow Park, another being Market Plaza, downtown. Kind of curious, what are your thoughts between those two sites for that event center?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard arguments for both, and people who prefer one site over the other, they both have really good points and are really staunch, advocates for their team. I'm open to hearing those arguments. I think it's important that we wait to hear back from the consultants and see what they have to say, because I think that information is important. We have to, I think part of the role as a city councilor is to balance the needs of what the residents want, but also look at information from people who are, experts in their field. And I never quite like the word experts, but who have more knowledge in the field than I might. In a particular field,
because the city council isn't made up of engineers and marketing experts and business experts. You come from all different kinds of fields, but you're not.
We're not experts in all of those things. That would be great if we were, but it would take. I feel like I'd need to be 400 years old, which our lifespans do not currently work that way.
We're getting there.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in hearing back what the consultants have to say, and I think the information that they give on all the locations might be helpful in future discussions, which is why for example, one of the locations is the proposed locations was the No Frills downtown, which I said I would not be in favor of building it there, just because I think it's really important to have a grocery store there. But I do think the information that they might gather about that location might be helpful in future decisions. And if we're gonna, the cost of paying the consultants doesn't necessarily change with, removing one or two sites. So if we're gonna pay them this much, we may as well get as much information as we possibly can from them, to help with this decision and possibly with future decisions as well. I'm not necessarily leaning one way or the other. Like I said, I've had people who are for Morrow Park or Market Plaza reaching out to me. And then I've had folks, there are people suggesting the GE site, which I hear and I understand, but it's just not feasible at this point. At least if we're looking to build this event center in the next couple of years, just because the GE site requires a lot of remediation. And it's still owned by GE, like the city doesn't own it. So, and if we were to buy, it would take, it's not a decision that we can just meet on, Friday and by Monday it's ours. It's just not going to happen that way.
Yeah. So how much does the cost of everything factor into a decision for site selection?
It has to be one of the big topics, because the money that we're spending is constituent money, or some people say taxpayer money. And that's really important. If people are giving us the money, we have to make sure that we manage it very carefully and that we spend it wisely. So definitely, Morrow Park has the advantage that it's already city owned. That being said, the city has purchased land before for uses for its projects. So it's not something that is, unknown or has never been done before. Unprecedented is the word I'm looking for. But if the cost is definitely something, I think that will weigh quite heavily in the decisions that are being made. Yeah.
Now, as we've said before, it can be tough during finance committee meetings, because there's X number of dollars, but then you have, so many more things that you're being asked that you could do with that money. So money is an unlimited factor, or an unlimited quantity, I should say. So is the city, or are you, I should say, you okay with spending more money under the promise that maybe by spending a bit more on this project, maybe $10-20 million more, you might get more people coming into town, more tourists, more economic benefit for businesses? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be thought about. And if is spending a little bit more now going to have a bigger return later? Oftentimes that is the case, but there's never a guarantee for that, right? So it's important to see what other cities are doing, and I think it's Kingston that recently built a similar, not recently, I guess recently in the grand scheme of time, built a center similar to this, and they're seeing huge return on it. So it's important to look and see what other communities are doing, what sort of return on investment they're getting.
Yeah, I think it's Kingston and Oshawa that both have downtown arenas.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And at this point, I'm not speaking particularly about the location, just in terms of having a center like this at all. And I think if the economic benefits are going to be such that we see quite a huge return on investment, it might be worth spending that little bit extra money, lot of extra money, I should say a little bit, extra money to get sort of the facilities that really would be good and that would help attract. And then we can look to seeing what can we do with that money that we're getting from that center, whether we can use it to address some of the other issues that are coming up as well.
So what do we then do with the existing Memorial Center building?
That is a great question. One I definitely do not have an answer for.
Oh, okay then. All right.
But that is a great question. Yeah.
And that is something that the consultants would look at. So.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's one that I did ask. If we, you build a new one, what do we do with the old one? Do we continue to use it as sort of like a community center? Do we do we gut it and put something else in it? What can be done with it? But yeah, it's a question I have asked and received a couple responses on, but nothing that's confirmed or anything.
See if we can tear the seating out and turn that into a convention center. I think a lot of people would be happy with that.
Yeah, that was definitely an option. Yeah,
we need more convention center space in Peterborough, which
I've heard that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are gonna get I think it's there's 500 seat 500 person convention space that's gonna be in the new Canoe Museum, which
yes.
Yeah. What do you think?
I don't know about the seat number. It's funny because the Canoe Museum is one of those things where people are like, oh, why are we spending so much money on this when, there's other needs. But the Canoe Museum, I think, is, I admit, when I first heard of a canoe museum, I was like, really? A museum just for canoes? And then I went and I thought, this is amazing. And every time I go, I'm more and more impressed by it.
I think a lot of people look at the building from the exterior, and it is a fairly unimpressive experience.
Right.
Exterior, but then you go in there, and it is complete. Like it is something else.
It really is, and then you go on a guided tour, and it's amazing. There's so much to learn about our community, but also Canadian history and global history just through stories being told by the canoe. And there's I forget the name of the one of the. I don't know if he's a curator. I forget his exact title and his name, unfortunately. But I met him, a couple of weeks back, and he took me to sort of their, there's a museum, and then there's a warehouse on the side that has a lot more canoes that they're not able to put on display. And he was telling me the history about them and stories about them, and just listening to him, I was like, wow, I learned so much in this 15 minutes about the history of Canada and told through stories of the canoe. So I think it's a great facility to have. I think we're really lucky to have the Canadian Canoe Museum here, and I'm excited to see how it looks in its new location by the lift locks. I think that's an excellent location for it, and I would say the board of the Canoe Museum is doing its job in terms of finding funding for it that's external of the city. The city did commit to some monies over, I think it was 5 years for the museum, and I support that. But I'm really glad to see that they're going elsewhere and trying to find funding for it. And I do think it has possibilities of, like you said, attracting meetings here. And there's definitely a multi-use space that can be used for several organizations. I know that's one of the challenges is that organizations try to host events and there are a limited number of spots that they can do that at, so I think that'll be an added bonus.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. That's supposed to start construction this year, and then I think they said their opening date is 2022 if everything goes as planned, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But you're right, that is one of those properties that especially around budget time, because the city did contribute some money towards that project, or is contributing money towards that project. I forget the city's exact amount, but the total amount of government support that it's receiving is about $15 million. So that is one of those projects that you see people say, well, why are we funding this massive canoe museum when we have X going around? But I don't know. I know
think it's important to fund both. Like, it's the same thing with the cycling lanes. Why does it have to be one or the other? Why can't it be both? That's
yeah. It's, you're always going to have those naysayers that say, we should be funding this thing. And then there are some genuine arguments in there that there are other causes that also deserve kind of these funding opportunities as well.
Definitely. Yeah.
So we're just about to wrap up. We got about a minute left on our time, so I'll leave it with you. Is there anything else that you want to add or discuss? Or
there's so much. But it's been, so it's what month are we in? February, so December, January. So it's, I've been a counselor for two and a half months, and the amount that I've learned in 2.5 months is incredible. And part of one thing that I was hoping to do as a counselor was to sort of, to make easier to understand, to make city council easier to understand, and make city hall easier to understand. So I'm hoping to, I don't quite know how I'm going to do that quite yet, but whether it's going to be a series of videos or blog posts, but that's not something that I've forgotten that I said I would do. Because I think the more people understand it, the easier they can, access it. And it's, it shouldn't be sort of this big scary place or this, big scary building that people are afraid of going to or don't understand how it works, because it's, we work for you. So it's important that people know how to access it. So that's one thing I'm really looking forward to, as with many other things. But if the next 2.5 months go like the last 2.5 months go, then woof.
You're going to be a very busy person.
Yeah, it's, I thought I was busy before, and now it's like, oh, I have half an hour to do everything else in my life.
All right, Kemi, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and to everybody else, we'll see you again soon.